It's now my great pleasure, very great pleasure, to call back to this stage for the fourth time our great and good friend Wade Davis. We're used to him talking to us about voodoo, about ayahuasca, about ethnodiversity and biodiversity, but today he's on to a different question. On the occasion of its 100th anniversary, he's going to help us imagine what was the world's state of mind on the brink of that monstrous and accidental mass insanity called the First World War. Wade Davis.
You know, there's always an opportunity for ethnography, and Stephen, this wonderful American climber, just said to me, why is it that when I bounce into Canadians, they always say, I'm sorry? And it reminded me of Jan Morris famously said you could drown of niceness in Vancouver because it had happened to her. And what Americans don't understand is that the phrase in Canada, I'm sorry, is not an apology, it's a mantra. It's a way of saying, look, you know, we lived for most of our history in this impossible place where there were more lakes than people. You could turn the United States on its side, plunk it into Canada, and still have 1,500 kilometers running away to the north. And we live in a civil society, and you didn't want to hit me, and I didn't want to be hit by you, and so I'm sorry. And that's, to me, the pure sign of being a Canadian, is when you understand that. But that may be the only point of levity in this short talk. Everything you know about your life, every sense you have of being modern, every neurotic affliction, affectation, was all born in the mud and blood of Flanders. Darwin, Freud, these were men of the 19th century, but their ideas, in the case of Freud, that you didn't control the sanctity of your thoughts, in the case of Darwin, that you didn't, that species were mutable, in the case of Einstein, that the apple doesn't fall as Newton thought it did. All these ideas found fruition in the 20th century, fertilized in some sense by the agony of the dead. Joyce, jazz, Cocteau, Dali, Mao, Hitler, Stalin, all offspring of the carnage. For a century, Europe had been at peace, even as industrial ambitions created power. Colonial ambitions created nooses that spread around the world and then met and then strangled the heart of civilization. And then finally, drastically, a single bullet fired in the breast of a prince in Sarajevo sparked the greatest cataclysm in the history of humanity. Winston Churchill recognizes, some don't, that the Second World War was but the child of the First, and he famously said that never was there a war less necessary to fight than the first, or more essential to win than the second. And my obsession with this war began innocently enough in the spring of 1996 when I traveled 4,000 miles across Tibet with a close friend of mine, and it was in that fateful spring when the debacle happened on Everest that Krakauer wrote about it. And my friend Dan Taylor, who was a close friend, whose father was a close friend of Howard Somerville, Mallory's closest friend on the mountain in 1922 and 24, was particularly disturbed by this unnecessary loss of life. And the very next fall, we were trying to photograph snow leopards on the Kenchung face of Everest in the Gama Valley. And Daniel, in his inimitable way, began to speak of these Englishmen dressed in tweeds who flung themselves against the flanks of Everest, reading Shakespeare in the snow at 23,000 feet. And I became completely enamored of these early British expeditions. And the story is well known. Britain, an empire of explorers, had famously lost the race to the poles. Everest emerged, shining above the Raj as the third pole. In 1921, they set out to find it. In 1922, to climb it. And then, on June 8, 1924, George Mallory, 37 years old, the most illustrious climber in Britain, along with his young protege, Sandy Irvine, were last seen cresting a northeast ridge, going strong for the summit when the mist rolled in and enveloped their memory and myth. And since then, mountaineers have been haunted by the possibility that Mallory reached the summit before he met his end. But I was never interested in that question. I wanted to know who these men were. And I knew from their age and class that invariably they would have gone through the agony of the Western Front. And my thought was that not that they were cavalier about death, but they would have seen so much of death that it had no mystery to them, nothing more to teach them save that of their own. For them, life mattered less than the moments of being alive. And so I set out over 12 years, visiting 57 archives, to try to find out where each of the 26 men who walked off the map in 1921 to come to close encounter with a mountain that no European had seen before, where they had been every day of the Western Front. Now, that may seem like an impossible task. It was famously said of the Great War that the British Army lacked the clerk power to tabulate the dead of Passchendaele and the Somme, but if that was true, they kept records of just about everything else. That war was so thoroughly chronicled that it's a wonder men found time to fight. And what's more, the zone of operation was remarkably small. The British front was never longer than 110 miles. It was never deeper than 40 miles, an area the size of the county of Lincolnshire. And yet behind that limited frontage, they would build 6,000 miles of trenches, 6,000 miles of railroad. The salient around the Belgian town of Ypres, with 4 miles by 12 miles, would be a cauldron of death in which 1.7 million boys would die. And because so many people rolled through this terrain, and because it had been chronicled in so many forms and poetry and letters and diaries and fictional accounts and military regimental records, there was no corner of that battlefield that hadn't been chronicled every day throughout the war in multiple voices, from the aching sighs of a young subaltern broken in shell shock to the bombastic boasts of a young Yorkshire sergeant. So I was able to not only ascertain where my characters, all 26 of them, had been, but to ascertain with a level of specificity that would have been unimaginable before the research what they had endured. And this journey itself was, as Sassoon said of shell shock, a journey through the twilight memory of hell. At the outbreak of that war, a man had to stand 5'8" to enter the British Army. Within 2 months, men 5'8" were readily recruited. Cremation was born of that war. Before the war, it was unknown in the British Isles. In the wake of the war, it was a preferred form of burial for countless tens of thousands who had lived 4 years and 4 months with the scent of rotten flesh from no man's land. Plastic surgery was born of the war and the need to repair the shell-scarred faces of young boys who for the rest of their lives would live behind special masks and attend holiday camps where they could remove the masks and feel the wind on their gargoyle features without fear or humiliation. The regular British Army required 2,500 shovels for the Empire. On the front, 10 million were required. 25,000 Welsh coal miners spent the entire war underground, ferreting beneath the German lines to detonate massive charges of TNT, which reverberated with such concussive power that it could be felt on Hampstead Heath in London. You have this image of bayonet charges. Bayonets accounted for 1/3 of 1% of the mortality during that war. 35% of the lads were shut down by machine gun fire or rifle fire, but 65% died, clinging in terror to the mud wall of a trench as a rain of fire and steel fell from the sky. The French army would lose so many men that 75% of every lad 18 to 34 in the entire French population was either wounded or killed in that war. Women spoke about the war through the metaphor of dance. Diana Manners said by the end of 1916, every boy I'd ever danced with was dead. Vera Brittain simply said by the end of the war, there was no one left to dance with. And Stephen Spender said that the British middle class continued to dance, unaware of the fact that the dance floor itself had fallen out from beneath them. And so if these journeys began as a gesture of redemption for an empire of explorers who had lost the race to the poles, they became, in the wake of the war, a kind of journey of regeneration for a nation bled white by the conflict. And the saga of these men was simply incredible. Of the 26 men who went to Everest in those 3 expeditions, 6 escaped the war, 2 old, 2 young, diplomats, school teachers, but 20 saw the worst of the conflict. 6 were severely wounded, including Jack Hazard, who climbed to the top of the North Col in 1924 with open bleeding wounds, saturating his climbing tunic, wounds from the Battle of the Somme that never healed. 4 were surgeons who dealt every day with the rivers of the dead and dying. 2 lost brothers in the war. 1 spent the war in an asylum suffering from shell shock. On the very day that George Mallory disappeared, there was another climb in the British Empire of a modest mountain in the Lake District called the Great Gable. Here, led by Geoffrey Winthrop Young, Mallory's mentor, who had lost his leg to an Austrian shell on the Italian front, and with him was a Canadian, Arthur Wakefield. And they were there to dedicate a plaque to all the members of the Fell and Rock Climbing Club who had been slaughtered in the war. Wakefield steps forward and begins to speak of the breath of the Moor, the spirit of self-sacrifice that led them all to go to their own obliteration. And then he began to howl, great sighs of grief that were heard on all the adjacent peaks, and then he never said a word. And never again would he express emotion, nor would his children see the inside of a church, even though he entered the war as a Christian missionary, part of the Grenville mission in Newfoundland. Well, what had happened was this. He was serving at a casualty clearing station on the Somme front on the fateful morning of July 1st, when at 9:15 his beloved boys of Newfoundland, each one of whom he had physically brought into the world, were sent into an attack. Of those boys, 68 came back unscathed. For 2 weeks, he went through the seas of wounded to try to hear the lilt of the Newfoundland accent, the blue puttees unique to the regiment. It was like the entire regiment had simply disappeared, and it had. And these casualty clearing stations were extraordinary places because in battles that had 75% mortality rate, you had to crawl or creep your way to these stations, and there you went through a process of triage. If you were destined to die, a red cross was placed on your forehead. If you could be immediately evacuated to the hospital trains, you slipped away to the French coast. The attention of the 8 surgeons who worked 2 to an 8-hour shift, a 6-hour shift, went to those who would die if they did not get immediate attention. Howard Somerville, Mallory's great friend on Everest, walked out on the day of the Somme, having been told to expect 1,000 casualties, found himself with one other doctor surrounded by 6 acres of dying boys. He never came back from Everest. He became a medical missionary in the south of India, dedicating the rest of his life to save the living, that they might sweep away all memories of the dead. So in the wake of the war, when the effort for Everest began, as Tom Longstaff famously remarked, the supply of young climbers was not what it was before the conflict. Noel came to the stage of the RGS in March of 1919, looking out over the sea of the assemblage as he began to speak of his secret journey in disguise in 1913, getting closer to the mountain than anyone. They then had to decide who would go, and from this remarkable assembly of rather mousy-looking individuals, you wouldn't quite think that this was the first British expedition to approach the flanks of Everest. But let me tell you how mousy they are. Sandy Williston, team physician, 1905, responds to an advertisement in the London Times, leaves on 24-hour notice, travels 3 months to reach an expedition in Uganda to the mountains of the moon, spends 9 months in the jungle, and when the expedition is over, he thinks, what the heck, why go back the same way? He walks from the source of the Congo to the mouth, becoming the second man since Burton to do it. George Mallory, over here, my favorite, Howard Bury. Howard Bury stripped his clothes, anointed his body with scented oils, and naked walked the length of the Ganga, killing a man-eating tiger that had run off with 27 holy men. And he, in time, would befriend an Asiatic bear that grew up, and his favorite form of exercise at his estate in Ireland was to wrestle naked with this massive Asiatic bear. So they move and they march into Tibet on these remarkable unknown trails, and then an amazing thing happens. They get into the shadow of Kampazong, and Arthur Kellis, 56 years old, high-altitude physiologist, too old for Everest, succumbs of exhaustion and dies. Oliver Wheeler, the unknown Canadian hero of Everest, the man who would spend more time on the mountain exposed to the wrath of the mountain than anyone else, and the man, not George Mallory, who found the route to the mountain, the most illustrious Canadian that no one has ever heard of, wrote that morning of Kellis's burial the most remarkable journal entry. They buried the old boy in the morning, thought it would be the afternoon, terribly sorry to have missed it, but I do hate funerals. Well, how do you possibly miss the internment of one of the 6 men you're walking across Tibet with? I knew the answer lay on the Western Front. He went to RMC and graduated the most illustrious cadet in the history of our military academy. Peeled off to India, was a Royal Engineer. He joined the 7th Merit Division, peeled back to France at the outbreak of hostilities. By that point in time, the topography of Armageddon had come into place. The British Expeditionary Force was annihilated. The entire Allied line was held by the Canadians in the north and the Indians in the south. And it came to their attention that the Germans had begun to sap our lines, putting trenches perpendicular close to our frontage. And Wheeler was given the duty of going over the top in a rainy, miserable night in November and burying those saps, but doing so in a way that would ensure that the Germans did not attempt that tactic again. He goes over the top, all hell breaks loose, The saps are full of Germans about to attack the Indians. Hand-to-hand combat of the most ferocious sort pushes the Germans back, but not before the trench is lying 3 bodies deep, chest to chest, as Wheeler would write in his journal, of dying boys of both sides flailing about like trout in my cradle. And that's what he meant when he said he does not like funerals, because he had to bury all those men alive. And so here they are in 21, the legendary Rongbuk Monastery, behind it the north face of Everest. Zatru Rinpoche, the Lama of Rongbuk, who found the British aspirations completely ridiculous. I mean, for a Buddhist to waste a precious incarnation to climb into dead rock in a place where oxygen deprivation alone obliterates consciousness is just about the most foolish thing you could do with a precious life. But eventually, Mallory and company find their way to a place called Windy Gap. They're hunting for a route to the summit, a saddle that will lead to a ridge that will lead to a ridge that will lead to the summit. He hates Canadians, Mallory. I don't know how you hate a Canadian, but George Mallory hated Canadians. He disdained Oliver Wheeler. And yet what does he do when they finally have this view across this upper Rongbuk, East Rongbuk Glacier to the col of their desires, the North Col, and when they are about to climb to Everest, who is the one man he takes with him? Oliver Wheeler. And the day Mallory took this photograph, he lied twice in letters to his beloved wife Ruth, saying if only we knew where this river of ice reached. But he did, because Wheeler's sketchmat of 2 weeks before had told him. It was our Oliver Wheeler, the incredible Canadian hero, who found the route to Everest that all climbers use to this day. And when they did, the two of them, summit the North Col, reaching higher than any man had ever reached in history, Wheeler said that the only way they survived the wind was to remember how they had survived the battles of France, by breathing beneath the concussive power of the wind between the blasts of the shell fire. And then in this incredible poignant moment, that night, Wheeler's legs frozen to the point of amputation, he is kept alive by none other than George Mallory, who stays up all night rubbing his feet with whale oil. And I guess I want to just close by saying, when we think of these men and what they achieved and who they were, they're a kind of person we'll never know again. These were men of discretion, decorum. They were not prepared to litter the world with themselves or yield their feelings to analysis, but they were men so confident in their masculinity that they could speak of love between men without shame. They could collect butterflies for the British Museum in the dawn, paint a watercolor before lunch, discuss Keats and Shelley and Shakespeare over lunch, and still be prepared to assault the German line, or indeed the flanks of Everest, by dusk. These are a kind of man we will never know again, but the most amazing thing for us all to remember is that these men were our grandfathers. Thank you.